We're here for the session you've been waiting for, the last one. I knew it. Before we start, I just want to thank Linda for organizing this, APS for putting it all together. We have a hand. It's a pleasure to be here. I grew up in Philadelphia. I walk past these buildings, probably every second or third year. Must have been some field trip down to Independence Hall, see the Liberty Bell, something or another. And I had no idea what the American Philosophical Society was, let alone that they would open the door to me to come and be part of this kind of a event. And it's really been fun. It's been fun, I think, for all of us to get to listen to ideas from different perspectives. And I was a little taken back when I found out that I was supposed to think about models for sustainability. That was the name of our panel. And I had to look about it and think about it. A sustainability of what is always the question. And it's fieldwork, the future fieldwork. So obviously sustainability of fieldwork. And I thought, well, that means long-term study. If you're sustaining a field project over multiple years, that's long-term study. And so I thought, I know something about long-term study. I started this project on a small parrot in Venezuela 40 years ago when I was a postdoc, kind of a side project. You know, I was down there doing other research on a snail-eating hawk, and well, those side projects have a way of taking over your life. You look back 40 years later, you say, what's a long-term study? How do you know you've been in a long-term studies? When trees that you've sheltered under are now dead and falling over, you know? So that's been one of them. And then another has been working with colleagues on the Grinnell Resurvey Project, where we began over 20 years ago to follow in the footsteps of Grinnell, Joseph Grinnell, in the places that he visited and left behind a treasure trove of field notes, along with his students and his students' students, and specimens. But those field notes contain a tremendous amount of ecological observations. That's what made his work really unique, I think. And that he took his field notes in a somewhat systematic manner. And we've, figured out how to reconstruct a baseline from those field notes and revisit those sites now all across California to look at the effects of climate and land use change. And that project's still kind of continuing on. Most of the field work is done. And then another long-term project also in California is a study of rails. Rails are very secretive water birds, so secretive I'm not even going to show you a picture, because they spend their entire life under high vegetation. And we'll conduct surveys, 400 or 500 surveys a summer, and see them maybe 4 or 5 times. But they'll answer our calls, and so we'll know they're there. And we treated wetlands as if they were individuals and learned a lot about what rails needed by learning about the demography of wetlands, so to speak, what made them turn over from year to year. And we realized the wetlands were basically the purview of the landowners. The landowners themselves were stewards of those wetlands, of the birds, even though they never saw them. The birds are endangered. So there was a certain amount of pride for those ranchers to have those wetlands, which are springs for the most part. And the rails were also being affected by a West Nile virus. So we had this really interesting coupled human natural system that we worked with a sociologist, an economist, a hydrologist, and a disease ecologist to try and understand the interactions of. There never are conservation problems in the absence of people. So this kind of coupled human natural system can be a pretty powerful model for understanding. And I realized that these were all long-term studies, and there were certain value to these long-term studies that you don't get from short-term studies. And so I think they can yield interesting and important ecological baselines, to understand community responses, okay? An ecologist, when I mean community, I just mean like a bunch of species, an assemblage of species that may or may not be interacting, but you know, new ones turn up with gradual change, like climate warming, or disappear. And then there's rapid episodic events like drought and fires that suddenly changed the whole community. These, you know, field notes, long-term studies are providing insights into species processes in multiple generations. Changes in demography from year to year. Birth rates, death rates. These are the keys that lead to evolutionary innovations through natural selection, of course. Changes in fitness that we can demonstrate over the long term. And these things result in either populations persisting or going extinct. You know, one of the ultimate currencies in conservation. And in quantifying, you know, how human cultural practices, social dynamics evolve and persist, you need long-term data to do this well. Rare events. In that parrotlet study, we kind of stumbled onto infanticide. And then we also realized that wasn't the only thing happening. There was adoption going on when a female lost her mate and a new male came in. And so these rare events accumulating over 40 years, you know, gave us a robust data set to be able to work out the fitness benefits of those things. And it's these kinds of things that inform conservation and management. So long-term field studies, there aren't a lot of them. So it turns out this one on the parrotlets, well, it's probably the longest one with marked individuals, in tropical ecosystems now. And they are hard to keep going. What makes a sustainable long-term field study? That's some of the things that we're trying to think about, you know. And you're going to hear the themes about this presented by our next three speakers, all right? You've got to have research questions that are innovative, multidisciplinary, forward-looking, blah, 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 okay? But they got to be adaptable because the aha moment, the view from the field is often really different than what you get in the armchair. And there is that, yeah, I can't believe that actually happened. The methods themselves, you know, you have to have some good structured data collection, but it's also got to be adaptable to take in new information as you start to encounter it. So those little side notes and field notes, you know, there has to be some space for those kinds of things, or a field notebook to accompany the well-structured forms that those data are being taken in so that you can record those. And then somehow you've got to curate them. They got to have a lifetime of their own somewhere, probably both digitally and in physical format. Personnel, that's key. Like, you have to have stable personnel, but at the same time, to ensure enough continuity, you've got to also accommodate new participants. You know, you've got to include multiple researchers and local participants, you know, who can collaborate in an ethical fashion. We've got lots of discussion of what an ethical fashion might be. But some stability is really important. And so the place where this field work is taking place in is pretty important. You know, it's got to be ecologically relevant, large enough for the processes to occur, take place, to have a population, whatever your samples are. You know, there's got to be a good infrastructure to support it through living space for the researchers or current and future scientific technologies. Ideally, politically stable. Can't go to Venezuela anymore for various reasons. But we have managed to keep the project going. Carl Berg, who I've handed it off to, faculty member at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, has a well-trained group of Venezuelans who are participants in the project and managing to keep this going, assuming we can financially support it. And that is not easy. long-term sounds important, but for NSF, it's innovative, new. Got to be something that you can show as breaking new ground, and can't just be monitoring. And so that's why all the more important are these questions that that we're going to be able to ask that are insightful and in some way new. And then that finances, it's got to be a diverse portfolio of sources. That's been my experience, because you have good years, you have shoestring years, where you're funding that research sometimes on the side of something else in order to keep it going. Maybe even sometimes with personal money. And then last, public engagement. This is outreach to multiple audiences, multiple participants, multiple venues of producing information. So I think like all of these kinds of activities that create a sustainable long-term field project, you're going to hear about them today from our speakers. And I'd like to introduce for you the first one. Nancy Simmons will lead off. She's the curator in charge of the Department of Mammalogy at the American Museum of Natural History and a professor of the Richard Gilder Graduate School. Now, we really haven't talked about field work, I don't feel like, with much passion the last few days. And biologists tend to have their favorite field things that they take with them into the field. It turns out Nancy has a pair of rubber boots that she's worn in the field since 1991. She told me, quote, "Longer than I've had my children, so they mean a lot to me." And well, catching bats in Thailand a few years ago, there were a lot of elephants around, and Nancy stepped in their poop. That, by the way, is a biological term, poop. She almost didn't get her beloved boots back through customs into the US because they're being investigated and looked at by the US Department of Agriculture. She had to sacrifice her toothbrush to clean the treads of that boot, but she still has her field boots today, and her children. Nancy's talk is entitled Large Team Multidisciplinary Collaborative Research on Bats in Belize. Nancy.
Thanks. So today I'd like to tell you about an unusual field program I've been part of for the last couple of decades in Belize. So this is where our study area is located in north central Belize, and it's circled here on this tourist map because it is a partially excavated Mayan city. And the reason that the forest is still here is because this is a protected area by the country of Belize. The plazas and the trails that connect the excavated parts of the city are our research area, basically. So bat researchers have been going to Lamini since 1999, and I have a whole list of topics here of things that you can study about a community. And indeed, we have studied these aspects of the bat community at Lamini over the last 25 years and have publications on all of them. To date, there's over 100 publications. I think we're probably close to 150 now by researchers, and there's been a vast amount of collaboration amongst people's labs and work. So somebody working on diet in bats may collaborate with someone working on the microbiome and so on. So this has been an amazing system and an amazing set of people to work with. However, like many field programs, it started small. Back in 2000 or 1999, there were only half a dozen people from a single lab who somebody had told them they might be able to study some bats in this area, and they went and found, yeah, this is a great place. By 2007, there were several labs going, and it's just continued to grow and grow over the years. So nowadays, we have about 80 people, that's 80 researchers going with 50 to 55 people per week for somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks, and we go the same time of year every year. And so the 2024 picture, that's only like 1 week's set of people, minus the people who are asleep, and we took this picture. So it's a lot of people in the field, and the only reason it's possible is because of this place, Lamanai Outpost Lodge, which is an ecotourist lodge all the rest of the year. And they have welcomed us, and their owners and their staff have helped facilitate what we do for the last 25 years. So it's a tourist lodge, so they have cabanas that have, oh my God, they have beds, they have hot running water, they have electricity. It's wonderful for field work. And they have a central meeting area and a dining area for tourists. Now, when we're there, there's like twice as many of us as they ever have at any one time. So we have to eat in shifts, but they will cook for us, for all of us, for a couple weeks at a time, which makes it possible for us to get an enormous amount of work done. They also, about 25 years ago, built this room, which they built as a classroom, a place for tourist groups to meet or whatever, but they let us turn it into a field laboratory, so when we're there, it looks more like this. So how do you go about studying bats out in a tropical environment? So we're out there in the forest. What do? Well, like ornithologists, we use mist nets, which are very fine nets. Think about a volleyball net made out of threads with very small squares. We put these up in open spaces across trails, and then at night we hope that the bats are going to fly along and get trapped in them. We man these constantly through the night. We can remove bats without injuring them in any way, and then we have bats, which is just awesome. They're beautiful animals. We catch a lot of bats with the number of people we have in the field. So each one of these bags has a single bat in it. This is just part of one night's set of captures. So back in 2007, when like half a dozen people went for a week, they might catch 100 bats. On these field team now, our expeditions, we routinely catch over 1,000 animals in a 2-week period. And we've managed to do a ton of science on this and bring a lot of students in. We have trained over 65 students now. We have whole PhD dissertations and master's theses have been done here and parts of dozens of other ones. We now basically release probably 99% of the animals that we catch, and we tag virtually all of them with pit tags, which are what you might microchip your dog or cat. We're now putting these in bats, and so we have over 4,000 bats marked in this landscape. But all this has come with a lot of challenges and changes as opposed to the small-scale fieldwork that many biologists are trained on. So the first part of this is just people management. Planning beds and transport to and from the airport, which involves both being transported by road and by boat. So this is my life much of the year, is spreadsheets, color-coded spreadsheets with who's going to sleep in what bed. We've taken over a local, well, we use all the local guest house and the ecotourist lodge facilities to house people, and then getting plane reservations from people, oh my gosh. But the lodge staff, the people we work with, the only reason we can do any of this is the collaboration with the staff and the people of the village that we work in, who basically do all of this back and forth thing. They supply us with food. They get everybody to and from the airport. And so all this is just possible because of the lodge. Now we're also interested or worried about ensuring safety of all of our participants and planning for emergencies. And the solutions that we found for that are really both personal management. We enforce a buddy system so that we don't allow anybody to ever go off alone, and everybody who goes anywhere has to tell somebody who's staying behind where they're going. But also we use the lodge emergency procedure. So ecotourist lodges have a set of emergency procedures if anything happens. In the last 25 years, we've only had to evacuate people twice for medical emergencies, and in both cases, it was the lodge's medical facilities that helped us evacuate people to local hospitals, and everything turned out okay, although it was traumatic at the time. At the beginning of every week of every field season, we have a group meeting with everybody who's there, even if they've been there for 20 years and have heard it all a million times, to go over the rules and why we have them and why it's important for everyone, both rules for managing people and safety, but also animals. Starting about, I think probably it was 2017 or 2018, we realized we'd grown large enough that we really needed a code of conduct. And so because we're not a field station and we're not run by any single organization, we looked across a whole bunch of different options and we built our own code of conduct, which we have online, and it spells out all the things which are usually in codes of conduct these days about harassment and proper behavior and ethics. And we make everybody who comes read this and sign it. We also we make very clear to everybody what the reporting procedures are, and we have 2 ombudspeople that anybody at any time can contact either anonymously or in person if there any issues arise. And we've had a couple of issues arise over the years, which we've managed to deal with, I think, appropriately and compassionately for everybody, and to the point where I think everybody was satisfied with the outcome by using this system. Now, working with wild mammals, especially bats, we're concerned about safety, and particularly since COVID, we're concerned about pathogens. And the people, the bat research community, the IUCN Bat Specialist Group has come together over the last few years and developed a set of guidelines for what we call field hygiene. So these are actions that we take to protect ourselves from pathogens that bats may carry, and also to protect the bats from us, because as many of you know, we've learned that humans can give COVID to animals, and we're afraid of infecting our research populations if somebody comes down. So what this looks like in person is, this is me with a big bat, and back when I first started working with bats, I would never have worn a mask. And with a big bat, I would always have worn gloves to avoid being bitten. But with little bats, we frequently handled them barehanded. I'd be wearing a tank top and so on. These days, we enforce basic field hygiene, not just to protect ourselves, but to protect the animals. And we ask every member of our team to do so, even if they're not used to doing so in other places they may work. Logistics of managing large numbers of people. We have a bunch of different research sites. Some of them we have to drive to get to. Some of them we have to take a boat to get to. We have lots of gear. So we've sort of gone low tech in how we manage this. And this is the big blackboard in our field laboratory. And this is just one night of activities. And so basically I put the board up in the middle of every night, make sure that we know what the activities are that various research teams may be doing, make sure we have leaders. This allows us to figure out the gear, but it also lets us know where everybody's going to be. So I can take a picture of this, and I can know where every individual is every night or supposed to be. And the leaders of various teams know who's going with them, and so on. So this low-tech method actually has proven to be really helpful for us for managing this army of researchers. We also, of course, have to manage our animals. And when I first started working at Lemni, we had no centralized field record-keeping system. We had no methods for labeling bags, so you'd never know what was in a bag, what species it was, or whatever. We changed all of that. We label everything now. We gather data across the whole team. We've been doing this for years. We have a centralized field numbering system. But all this is great, but if you're a newbie coming in, if you're a new student who doesn't know the animals and doesn't know how things work, how do you get integrated into this team? And one of the things we've done, which has actually proven most popular, is we developed a field key to our fauna. So we have potentially 50, 60 different species of animals, and we just made a field key of what the species are that are there and what the field characteristics are that can be used to identify them. And this is super popular, not just with our new students and people who might not be familiar with the fauna, but also with the guides, the naturalists who work for the lodge, the local people. This way they can see pictures, and we can teach them about the animals as we go. We make a whole bunch of different copies of this, and I laminate them in heavy plastic so they go out in the field all the time. So they can get rained on and stomped on in the mud, and they still work. Permits are another issue. We haven't talked much about this. This is something we all face, which is a problem. In the early days, when it was just a few people, they'd have one set of permits, and this is just what it takes for one project to go there. So there are permits from the Archaeologist Institute and from the Forestry Institute. But then as projects proliferated, we ended up with a whole set of different permits, and so it was getting complicated. And now we've consolidated them back together again to one big blanket permit that covers everything. Same thing with sampling. In the early days, each individual research group or person might be collecting samples of various kinds, and they would export them themselves. So separate imports into wherever they were going. But with bat material now, it's not just a matter of getting stuff into the United States using Fish and Wildlife permits, but we have to have permits for the Centers for Disease Control too. And just to make this easier, to lower the boundary, particularly for a new researcher or somebody who's from a smaller institution who doesn't know how to do all of this, we now ship all our samples in one big shipment. So this is the mailroom at the American Museum with one set of samples coming back from one field season. We have, I think, 8 liquid nitrogen dry shippers there and 2 coolers, probably 6,000 samples. So they all get imported together, and then we split them up and send them to a dozen different institutions. This, however, means that we have to track these data very carefully. And it takes an individual, like one person, to just track all this data. So luckily, I can take staff from the AMNH. This is Ellie Hager, who this particular field season, her single job was just to track all the samples taken by every single different person in that lab and what was in every tube and what tube went into which dry shipper and all of that, so we know 100% what we have. So there's lots more spreadsheets and so on. Finally, one last thing we started worrying about recently is animal welfare. Now, we've always had IACUC approvals from the American Museum and many of the individual research teams. That's animal care and use mandated approvals that you need to do research. This little bat is getting some fruit juice here before being released. But 2 years ago, we established a bat welfare committee just for our field program. So we have individuals from multiple institutions here. Luckily for us, the second name there, Kevin Castle, is a wildlife veterinarian. And so we actually have a vet on our animal, wildlife, our bat welfare team. And conveniently, he's been working with us now for several years in the field because he's married to a bat biologist, so he's learned a lot about bat biology. But we started doing some things differently. We realized that we were probably keeping animals around too long because, something rare, somebody wants to take a picture, someone else wants a hair sample, people over there want to fly in the flight tent, and we were keeping animals too long for their own good, even though we weren't violating any of our animal care and use things. So we started changing the length of time we keep individual animals and moving a lot of our preparation out into the field. So here's some blood sampling and hair sampling going on, actually at the net, so the animal never has to go back to that field laboratory I showed you. So we've made all these changes as this program has grown larger and larger. We're not going to get any bigger because we don't have any more beds left within 10 kilometers of where we work. But it's been an amazing thing, and I have to say, in all my years as a scientist, this is the most rewarding thing, part of my research, bar none. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. That's inspiring to see something that big takes that much coordination. I'll never think about my spreadsheets in the same way again. Do they stay in the beds, by the way, or is it they're moving around? Don't ask. Okay. Our next speaker is Jill Pruetz, who is a Regents Professor, Department of Anthropology at Texas State University. She studied primates in Kenya, Nicaragua, Panama, Costa Rica, Peru, and Senegal, where Jill is the principal investigator of the Fongoli Savanna Chimpanzee project since 2001. So her research focuses on the environmental pressures that influence chimp behavior in the savannas and how that differs from chimps living in a forest environments where they're often studied. So I asked Jill if she'd had any close encounters with Africa's dangerous critters besides mosquitoes. And she responded that the alpha male chimpanzee in her study group charges her at least once a year, and Jill must stand her ground. It's not always frightening, but she does get an adrenaline rush out of this. It makes sense, given elsewhere I read that one of Jill's favorite movies is Jaws. Jill's a fountain of knowledge of how to implement and sustain long-term studies, and her talk today, The Future of Fieldwork, the Fongoli Savanna Chimpanzee Project. Jill.
Hi. So I am going to discuss the future of fieldwork using my own project, the Fongoli Savanna Chimp Project, which I began in the year 2001 as an example. There's many lessons I've learned over the years from this project, and I have very few regrets, maybe more than just very few, but I'm not going to talk about all those. One of the things that I wish I had thought more about, and which I'm going to talk about more here, and even one I wish I would have learned about as a graduate student, was how to manage a long-term project that is sustainable, beyond my tenure with that project and how to also best manage a research team. So field primatologists in the United States work outside of their home country because there are no native non-human primates here. And in most of the equatorial countries where non-human primates live, scholars and students don't have the same access to resources that someone from the US or from Europe has. So one of my goals is to encourage people who are starting their own projects to think about the sustainability of that project in terms of resources. So while we train students in the scientific process, we, of course, spend less time teaching them how to collaborate. Now I'm just going to say, see Nancy. Or to manage a research team or a research project with limited resources, although they seem to pick up on that really quickly. Since primates have relatively slow life histories and live for decades, long-term projects are desirable in order to provide important data on growth and development, aging, etc. And so I'm going to use, again, my own experiences as an example and perhaps a lesson. So as a graduate student, I understood the fact that running a long-term continuous field study on wild primates would entail a constant search for funds. What I did not think enough about when I began my project was how to sustain it after I was gone or after I was unable to be as active as I am now. I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon, but I gave little thought to a time when I would not be here. I was in my early 30s. I thought I would live forever, of course. And I really have little recollection of discussing the issue of sustaining a long-term research project until I spoke with other project directors when I was already out in the field, when I had already initiated my own project. My postdoctoral experience of grant writing really brought home the fact that I would need to keep up a constant search for funding. And I guess I should mention that with the chimpanzees I study, we have a constant presence, so we're out there collecting data each day. Hopefully, we try to anyway. If that were not to happen, they would lose their habituation to us as observers. You'd have to start the process again. So we need to have a continuous observational schedule of the chimpanzees. So of course I knew that grant proposal writing would take up a great deal of my time. It was especially challenging in the early years when the chimps were not habituated to researchers. So basically we were talking about chimp poo, to use another scientific term, or chimp nests, etc. But we did ultimately habituate chimpanzees in this very challenging habitat, and we discovered quite a number of interesting things about them. But of course, I knew there would be gaps in funding, as everyone has. So one of the things that I did early on is that I did start off with a small number of people on my team, the Fongoli team. And so this made it possible for me to bridge funding gaps with my own funds. My first academic position after I was a postdoc was at Iowa State University, a relatively large university, R1, and they provided much of my initial funding. They're a big ag school. They seemed to like chimps. They didn't know what I was doing, but they liked it. And then another thing I did was I focused on one social group of chimpanzees. I would love to be able to study 5 different communities, as we call them, of chimpanzees. But one of the other things that we need to make certain of is that we're always there kind of keeping an eye on the chimpanzees. So not only financially was I concerned about taking on too much, but I was also concerned about the number of personnel for that. So I've always stuck to this one relatively small group of 35 chimpanzees. And I'm going to start talking about chimpanzees and get off topic, so I'm going to read. So here's me in the early years. This was our very small team there on the left, and that's just a typical view of the chimps in this type of savanna habitat. And so I had done a survey in southeastern Senegal. I had planned on working in a national park, like many people did. But then I identified a site outside of the national park that had high nest density. So chimps build night nests, and that's, before they're habituated, that's what you use to estimate densities. It took about 4 years of continuous presence to habituate the chimps. And I was interested to find that the population of chimps here was similar to what you see in a national park where humans have been excluded. So as a biological anthropologist, I am still interested in humans. So that was of interest to me as well. One thing that I learned early on, or I discovered early on, is that, of course, I need to work with the local community, even though I had official documentation from the state and Senegal. And as a country, I needed oral permission from one of the biggest villages in the area. And the people that work for me are not national park employees. And so, for example, while Senegal has a retirement plan, I am responsible for their retirement plan. And even once they have either left the project or even passed away, they still get benefits from me, and their widow receives benefits until she has passed away. And again, with a small number of researchers, this has been doable so far. But it's one of the reasons I established the Neighbor Ape nonprofit organization that does support chimpanzee conservation, but also works on development projects with the people that live alongside the chimpanzees. And in this one image, you can see that we're providing school supplies to the major school in the home range of the chimpanzees. So, of course, financial security is important and something that's been on my mind a lot, thus the subject of my talk. But collaborating with in-country scientists, students, and other citizens in Senegal has also been key to sustaining the field project. And of course, there are limitations to what my collaborators have access to in terms of financial resources. So this young man here is Dr. Landing Baji. He is the co-director of the Fongoli Savanna Chimpanzee Project. He's the first Senegalese that got his PhD in primatology in Senegal, the second ever Senegalese to get a PhD. And he finished a postdoc. He's currently in a full-time job, but he is instrumental to the project. And so between the two of us, we're working on a plan to come up with a long-term management plan. I feel like I'm talking long, so I'm kind of jumping ahead here. And this is the team today. It's twice as big as it used to be, so a very small team nonetheless. One of the things that primatologists have focused on quite a bit, anthropologists, other scientists as well, is the need to decolonize our science, especially when we work in countries other than our own. And that is something that we have focused on with the Fongoli Savanna Chimpanzee Project as well. And around about 2008, I believe, is when I established a completely Senegalese team on the ground there. So traditionally, as a primatologist, and I did this for a couple of projects, you manage someone's projects, you have students manage your projects, et cetera. I have students that work at my site, but again, in 2008, I established a project manager, Dondo Conte. You can see him there on the right, I believe. So sometimes he fills in for... Oh no. Thanks, guys. I'm looking at it. Okay. Thank you. There's Landing. We'll just go back. The Chimpanzee. There he is. So Dondo on the right is my project manager. He also fills in as a sound man sometimes. He can basically do anything. And then this is the rest of my field crew. So, for example, during COVID, when many projects had to pause, we did not. We adjusted our protocol, definitely, because of COVID and the potential for disease transmission, but we wanted to keep an eye on the chimpanzees. So this has worked out especially well for us. So 25 years later, almost 25 years later, it's not quite 25 years later, one of the things that I am really interested in doing is helping young scholars think ahead. I've worked for 2 universities during my tenure as a professor. They both helped me immensely, but I wish that I would have thought more about this sustainability issue much earlier. And so one of the things I have done recently is we're in the process actually of establishing an endowment for the project through Texas State University. And that at some point, hopefully, will grow enough so that the interest can be used to fund gaps in funding, et cetera, this type of thing. So that is one potential solution to that particular problem. And then I made this kind of provocative pie chart for y'all, and I would adjust the slices of the pie but I do think that there are some things that I feel like we should educate students in, again, in terms of managing and sustaining a long-term field project. And I don't have to talk more about the economic instability in today's political climate and the fact that we need to come up with creative ways to fund our research. One thing, again, that I did put in place sooner was that I have a completely Senegalese team on the ground there, and they make important choices, decisions, etc. I also have the co-director, Landing Baji, that has an equal say in management of the project. So I do wish I would have done that a little bit sooner as well. Like I said, I established a nonprofit that has helped immensely in terms of community relations. And we are now basically focusing on our financial stability. And I will go ahead and end it there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Our last speaker in the panel is Dr. Jennifer Yee. She is an independent scholar at Kino Bay in the Sea of Cortez, where she relocated this past spring. Prior to that, Jennifer was the director of the James San Jacinto Mountain Reserve from 2012 to 2025. So that is one of 40 field sites that are part of the University of California Natural Reserve System. The director of a field station is by nature a jack of all trades. She told me she got tired of shoveling snow this past winter, and so it kind of Mexico sounded pretty good at that point, I think. Her field research has focused on the evolution and hybridization of quails for 28 years. One of Jennifer's favorite parts of field research is figuring out where and how to find what she hopes to study, and then how to observe it. That meant that she has to have some special skills, and one of her special skills is removing rattlesnakes from quail pens, I found out. So if you want to know more about that, please ask her after we're done during our break. Field stations are key places for implementing field studies, and sustainability is a challenge for those. Jennifer's going to talk to us about that today.
Thanks for sticking around for the last talk of the day. I am going to carry on with the theme that many speakers have touched upon throughout the symposium. That is, how do we navigate the challenges we face to pursue fieldwork in a sustainable manner, especially across our lifetimes? That's the question and the heart of this conversation. So my co-authors, Paul Foster and Rhonda Struminger, are past and present presidents of the Organization of Biological Field Stations. And they encouraged me to depart from our paper for this presentation. They suggested that instead I use my career trajectory as a case study to illustrate one possible path to a life of sustainable fieldwork, mostly outside of the academy. I'm sticking with our paper's theme in that field stations and marine labs have been and still are critical to my journey, and they are also critical to the slow science movement. That is, place-based science rooted in the long-term ecological observation and deep commitment engagement, community engagement. So I'd like to frame my presentation with the words of Albert Einstein: look deep into nature and then you will understand everything better. I think I'm preaching to the choir here with that. What is slow science? Slow science isn't anti-progress, it's pro-quality. It's about taking the time to read broadly, think critically, and reassess our methods and results. And instead of chasing productivity metrics, slow science emphasizes community engagement and long-term connection with place and people. It reminds us that real discovery takes time, and that good science should move at the pace of the natural world that we seek to understand. My work began and continues today on the causes and consequences of hybridization in two species of quail, California and Gambel's quail, in the Colorado Desert. The key to getting my research off the ground was support by mentors, Drs. Rosemary and Peter Grant. Peter actually encouraged me to apply for the Franklin Award here, which I was awarded, and that helped to fund my research. And another part of the puzzle for me is that my graduate program provided research time without teaching obligations at all. As Christina mentioned earlier today, establishing work on an unstudied hybrid zone takes lots of searching, especially, which is especially true of upland game birds, which are hunted. Each semester, Rosemary, Peter, and I would take the entire spring semester and go our separate ways to spend the entire term in the field. And my dissertation formed the foundation of my long-term research that I still pursue in that area, as well as in the Sonoran Desert of Mexico now. Once I left my graduate and postdoctoral positions, I became a visiting professor at a small liberal arts college called Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. At this stage, I had access to field sites through local contacts, but no research station, limited funding, and very little time for field work. My focus during this period shifted towards undergraduate teaching, of course, and the experience highlighted the challenge of sustaining meaningful field-based research in a teaching intensive environment, and the crucial role that community partnerships play in keeping such work viable. But my experience at Whitman taught me that I would be devoting most of my time towards teaching and other duties if I stayed in academics. I sorely missed research, especially research on the quail hybrid zone that I developed. So when I was invited to give a talk for Darwin Day at Fresno State, I asked that they buy me a one-way ticket. I borrowed my host's minivan to search for a field truck. I hadn't had a car for 5 years. I'd been on a bicycle. And I moved back to my field station where I studied quail at Deep Canyon Desert Research Station without a position, an income, or savings. During my self-prescribed sabbatical, which is actually more like unemployment, I had one of the most interesting field seasons in my career, and I had the time to begin field studies, pilot field studies in the state of Sonora, Mexico, and to study the contact zone between Gambel's quail and elegant quail, a species that was new to me. My research direction began to change, and this field work broadened my idea of speciation in all 6 species of North American quail, which was a critical shift in my research focus. So, during my self-prescribed sabbatical, I had time, but no research funding. My work was guided more by curiosity than by funding trends or political agendas on the positive side. Oh, sorry, I've been not doing this. I did the same thing. So here's the kind of rainbow of quail. And here's when I was at Whitman College. So here's my sabbatical. And here's what we did. My colleague, Jennifer Calkins, and I decided to experiment with crowdsourcing. A small Kickstarter campaign launched our pilot studies in Alamos, Mexico, and resulted in an art-based project that blended science and storytelling called the Quail Diaries. The organization of biological field stations brings together field stations and marine labs, spaces that allow us to change over decades and to see the patterns that only emerge when we stay long enough to truly know a place and become part of it. OBFS is more than a professional network of field stations, and Marine Labs, it's a community dedicated to shaping the future of field work. And you'll note I put a QR code up there, so if you're interested in joining, please do, as an individual. For my career in the field, OBFS was a major stepping stone where I found colleagues that would support my profession for the following 13 years as field station director, but also as a scholar. At one OBFS conference in Belgium, I ended up meeting 2 social scientists who were from Alaska, of all places. We met in Belgium, and I had an existing NSF grant, but it was right at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. So my grant originally was aimed to launch a leadership training academy for women at field stations. Instead, we became co-editors of a book we published in 2024 called Women of the Wild: Challenging Gender Disparities at Field Stations and Marine Labs. Field stations aren't just coordinates on a map, they're living places with communities and histories. Besides serving as resident director of the James San Jacinto Mountains Reserve for 13 years, I maintained local projects, trained locals to read bird bands and help me band. Looking back on it, my position at UC did open some doors for my research program, and in the beginning of my tenure, I was able to travel off-site for short 7-day pilot field trips, which made my work possible in Mexico. So in those places, there were no field stations, and building trust, especially given the historical disconnect between researchers and local contexts, made the research more relevant and ethically grounded. So what started as a small pilot project funded through Kickstarter evolved into a formal collaboration through University of California, Mexis CONACYT money that you can only get if you're at one of the University of California campuses. And it also started through my connections with the San Diego Natural History Museum. This period marked a balance between research and field engagement. I had some salary, and I got to participate in the Grinnell and Swarth Centennial Resurvey that Steve mentioned. And that was great because you get to go out. This is Phil Unit, who's the curator of birds at the San Diego Natural History Museum. And it helped me to form what we became known as the Tres Amigas. So there's 3 quail that we were studying, and there were 3 of us, one from CICESE, one from San Diego Natural History Museum, and myself. And this is Horacio de la Cueva, who works at CICESE. So much of my time at the James involved mentoring colleagues, students, and sharing the system. So we talked about how do you pass on your system from one student to another, and that's sort of how I've tried to keep it going, is through postdocs. There's a postdoc on the right, and David Zonana, whom I suggested apply for a Lewis and Clark award, and wrote him a letter, and he got it, so thank you very much. So ultimately, I hope that we can find ways to encourage institutions to value depth over speed, and to recognize that slow, thoughtful science builds lasting impact. So this is a gentleman who is Comcac Indian, and he has been helping me. This is Desemboque on their reservation, the Comcac Nation, which is not Mexico, and he's been helping me to investigate some of the birds. So they've got some of the most pristine areas in the area, in the region of Kino Bay. And they told me about this thing called the pitaya quail. And it was something that I studied in the field and wondered what it was. And in fact, I had read that there's supposedly a subspecies of gambels that occurs nowhere else but on their land. So there's a quail on the top of that Sonoran cactus, saguaro, and there's my AI version of it, which has become my logo. And I just want to leave you with these parting thoughts. We risk losing the heart of science, its sense of wonder, inquiry, and responsibility when speed and output become our only measures of success. Let's choose depth as well as speed. Let's honor the time it takes to think, to read, to fail, and to try again. Let's champion meaningful questions over quotas and make space for science that serves both knowledge and community. To do this, we need to rethink what success looks like, supporting long-term projects, valuing depth and persistence, and fostering collaborative, respectful partnerships. If we invest in these values, we preserve not only the integrity of our science, but also its humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for some discussion and questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Kat Culbertson from UC Berkeley. Amazing discussion here so far. Something I've seen all of you touch on here, and something I've been thinking about a lot recently too, is sustainability of funding in the long term. And a few of you have mentioned even how oftentimes funding structures that currently exist, whether it be NSF grants that are really looking for innovation, or donors to conservation nonprofits that really want to see the next big solution and all the trees planted in the next 2 years, we have a system that's working against us right now. And clearly you all have been very innovative in this context. So I'm curious both What are some ways that you think about this conundrum and have found funding for long-term work with that in mind? And also, do you have any thoughts on how we can try and change overall funding structures and incentives to promote better investment in long-term science and long-term science with collaboration and investment in community capacity building?
I can speak a little bit to some of that, not all of it. My group, in part because of its size, we have people from 50 different institutions that participate in 20 different countries. And one of the things that's happened over the years is that the funding cycle has been different for different participants. Like, you know, in the last few years, there's been a lot of money for studying bats and pathogens and less money for ecologists. And what we find is that the people who have more money are helping support the parts of the program that don't have any money. So it's basically almost providing some bridge funding to our collaborators. And so that's one of the benefits of collaboration and collaborating across disciplines. And when you really build up a certain level of trust, your colleagues may help support your students. I sometimes buy plane tickets for people from other institutions who can't afford it, and then different people bring different things to the table, and over time, feast and famine in different parts of our program have really helped keep us going. That doesn't solve the problem for a single project, but it does for a collaborative effort across disciplines.
Okay, sorry. Is it on? It is.
You're good.
I mean, I guess I just wanted to mention, before I forget, there is Leakey Foundation has a fund to support long-term research on primates. So if you have a long-term research project, you can apply for that funding. It's bridge funding. But one of the things I have explored or somehow got into is collaborating with gold mines. Corporate gold mines in Senegal. Never thought I would. I still have mixed feelings about it as a primatologist, but I've worked with their environmental arms, and they have to do offsets. I worked as a consultant with them, and I was recently approached by a gold company from a different country. They can't do offsets in their country because of the lack of political stability. And so they came to me and asked about what they might do in Senegal. And so, of course, I had a long laundry list. They didn't seem to blink at that. But that's something they have to run by then other funding agencies, et cetera. But I told them about a grant that we had submitted to the National Science Foundation, about the endowment that I started, about just operating costs, things like that. And again, it's something, you know, in principle, I as a student, it's like, no, I'm not ever going to work with. Why would I work with a corporate gold mining company? They're destroying habitat, but it's a lot more complex. I've learned a lot, and they actually have been able to do things that we couldn't do as primatologists. They were able to move roads, keep roads from disturbing chimpanzee water sources, for example. So I've become more open-minded about it, and it is still new, but it is definitely something I didn't think I'd ever do.
I'd like to circle back to something, well, actually what both of you have done. Nancy, you've found an ecotourism lodge that has helped kind of, you know, bridge the gap, maybe even how much it would cost you to get all those people taken care of in all those beds. And also, I think, Jill, we are going to have to depend on the private sector. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And I'm a one-person show, and I did not intend to be on sabbatical for quite as long as I have been. So I wanted to leave I meant to leave at the end of 3 months, and gotten offered a house sit for 3 more months. And some people had an emergency, had to come back to the United States to go to the hospital. And so I extended to 6 months, and now I've sort of I am doing it just as Steve said. I mean, sometimes you just end up self-funding your own research and kind of patching things together in between all the windfalls of opportunities that you get. So that's what I'm doing. I'm doing a little remote teaching, and the cost of living in Mexico is so low that I just, basically teaching for 2 hours, I can pay for rent for a month. And the cost of living is low. So if your field site happens to be in a place where the cost of living is pretty low, it's kind of makes it a lot easier to just keep the research going.
Jordan.
Thank you. Piggybacking on that, I mean, I was just talking with some colleagues in the break before this panel, and I think all of your talks, and particularly yours, Jennifer, and that comment really, to me, crystallized what's emerging as one of the core themes of this whole 2 days we've spent together, which is this real tension between, on the one side, we've talked about taking time to reflect. We've talked about taking time to write field notes and build community relationships and create space for those aha moments, get to know your system, and in some ways get to know yourself too through the process. And then on the other hand, we have the reality of the world we're living in right now with things like the technology, the tether that ties us, the short attention span, the things that pull us away from the field. And then also the demands of the current university system right now and the publish or perish mentality and the promotion and tenure and the productivity. And it just seems like, and then more broadly, this sort of societal questioning of the whole use of universities and, what are universities really doing? What's research really doing for us? And it just seems like it really kind of distills down. And I think that your case, Jennifer, of actually pulling yourself outside of the university system, essentially, to be able to pursue that slower rate of science that I think we all, really believe and resonate with that in some ways. Like, I think it's just really I don't really have, it's more of a comment than a question, I guess, but it really seems like it's distilling down to this. When we talk about the future of field work, it seems like a very core tension that we, need to confront and are confronting, I guess.
I think it's easier to do when you're a little bit more established than as a graduate student. I'm not sure I'd advise that to graduate students. Also, I don't, it was cool to see each trajectory here of these 3 long-term studies. They all had their own kind of individual starts, and I can only say from my own experience that I did not go out to start a long-term study. That was not the plan. I'm going to do a long-term study on these parrots. It was like, oh, these parrots are interesting. Nobody knows anything about them. I think I'll start off doing some work. And then, one of the things we did was we experimented. We haven't talked about experiments. In fact, I don't think we talked about experiments in the past 2 days, because there is a little bit of a tension sometimes between observational work and experiments, especially how you're going to manage that in a system where you're trying to keep long-term field work going to understand, those patterns. And we'd kind of decided, no, we weren't going to be another Galapagos finch study, leave that for the grants. We started to do like some wholesale experiments in year 2 and 3 before, because we saw some cool patterns. Then after that, it was kind of like, I really wished we'd had some part of this that we hadn't experimented on. We recognized that we needed to maintain this in a longer term perspective also to get natural dynamics. And so one question led to another, and then pretty soon it seemed like it was a long-term study. So I don't think you always know, and funding it does require having some interesting questions. I think Anne had
Yeah, my question, so a theme of this conference seems to have been the need for both supporting local collaborators in the field who live there, and also early career researchers, and really finding ways to keep fieldwork part of training. And so for better or worse, my question for you guys is, especially having navigated these long-term studies, how do you, as more advanced career researchers, navigate authorship in these really large and long-term studies? You know, things like having researchers analyze these amazing data sets who maybe didn't go in the field, or for sure didn't go in the field every year, because that's just not logistically feasible for the most part. If you had any thoughts or recommendations and things like that.
Yeah, we've had to deal with that in our group because obviously we have people who are working with us who weren't even born when the work started in our field area. And so we have developed for different parts of our projects basically guidelines for authorship. So, collaboratively talking to both the younger members and the more established members and trying to be inclusive. And so people who've made significant contributions, even if they've only made it for a year or two, need to be recognized. And I think this is a thing across all of science. So one of the good things that's happened, I was talking to Scott about this, I think, earlier, is that during my career, we've gone from science where, you went in your office and you did your science, or you went in the field and you did your field work, and it was just you and maybe one or two other people, and so authorship was never an issue. There was a period of time when science became more collaborative, when the number of authors on your paper mattered, because review committees would say, oh, well, there's like 5 authors on this paper, so it doesn't really count for you, even if you led it. And so now we've come full circle, I think, so that nobody is surprised when there's multiple authors on a paper, and you can add local collaborators. Nobody counts, or I don't think most people count anymore. So you're expected to provide some statement of what your contributions were to a project rather than just counting the number of authors and dividing. So it's an important consideration, especially to be fair to early career researchers. And so in my group, the old dogs like me, we talk about this and we try and make sure that everybody in the group is fair to the younger people. And so we try to enforce fairness at all levels. And also sharing, what you were saying about experimentation. We have experimental physiologists who work with us. We have biomechanics people who work with us. And they want to do it, some of them want to do experiments. And some of them, so we have to balance, well, how many animals are they going to have for their experiments? Because then those won't be animals that these other people over here can fly in the flight tent. And then if we want to tag animals and release them, we don't want them to actually have been experimented on first. We want to release them after a minimal amount of holding time. So that all has to be balanced on the fly in the field. So balance and fairness are something sort of we deal at all aspects. Because you have to, or if there's no trust, then this whole thing would have fallen apart like a house of cards a long time ago.
I don't have a lot to add in except that we do try to be transparent, and before any data are collected or used, et cetera, I've got guidelines, and they're not set in stone, so hopefully there can be a conversation about it, about what my expectations are, what their expectations should be, whether they're working with me at my site, or a lot of my students work at other sites or in labs, et cetera, that type of thing. And I personally, I think Steve and I were talking about this, and I'm sure most people here have so much data they'll never, you could work 24/7 until the day you die and you'll still have data left over, right? And so I welcome students to work on my data set. It's harder to get them to work just on my data set because I do want to do field work. Who doesn't want to do field work? But yeah, I think just being transparent about it. And we've looked at various guidelines, but with my graduate students, we revisit it, and they talk about it in classes and ethics classes at our university and things like that too.
I have a similar experience and practice as Jill. Usually before I start a collaboration, we have a long talk about who's going to do what and who's interested in what portion of this, what is going on in the system, and oftentimes we step on each other's toes. And it's like, well, because I'm the person who has kind of the most experience, I just love talking about all my ideas all the time to somebody who wants to, who's interested. So it ends up that you influence them and you kind of like drag them into your own arena of questions. So I have to be really mindful myself of saying, oh, and this is your question, and let's talk about that, and let's kind of work on that area for you to kind of build up your own direction. So yeah, it takes just a lot of communication. Like I say, it takes like kind of consistent communication throughout the collaboration, because as you know, things change, questions change, interests change.
A question here.
Yeah, Eric Westhoff from Rice University. Thank you all so much. Yeah, the issue of sustainability as someone coming early career is daunting. I'm thinking about the people that I have gotten to know in the field and that I want to continue working with, and I'm applying for jobs right now and I have no idea who will let me do that, who will give me money to do that. I guess my slight tweak on the sustainability question is about personal sustainability, like sustainability of yourself to keep going, to keep being a field worker, to keep working in these systems that I feel like pretty consistently we're talking about are working against us. And just your perspectives on wellness and personal resilience and the sustainability of keeping that going in the decades you have.
I'd love to hop on that question, because that's why I resigned from my last position. And this is I guess, the most kind of well-balanced my life has ever been, because I can work remotely. I'm flexible to do it on days when I know it's going to rain, or, I'm not going to be able to go out to the field. And so I can kind of use that a little bit to my advantage, just to be doing something as much as I need to. I'm not trying to become a millionaire, and I'm also not trying to become part of the National Academy of Science. I've got one thing that I don't think most people want to even, I've got experience in kind of an esoteric thing. So my real contribution that I feel like I can make in my whole lifetime is doing what I'm doing. And that's incredibly rewarding. And I think that is what kind of makes you feel well. Plus, I get to do yoga and walk on the beach all the time when I'm not in the field,
And
right?
handle-
There's just more time to be yourself.
And handle quails and rattlesnakes,
And yes, cuddle with the quail and try to
not the rattlesnake.
keep your distance from the rattlesnakes.
Okay.
I just wanted to say briefly, because I feel like, just based on what, I learn a lot from my students. I feel like there's been a move to have a better work-life balance. I hope that is the case. When I worked at Iowa State for 16 years. All I did was work. But I loved it. I have no regrets. I got a lot done. And I spent about half my time in the field, which is my favorite thing to do, still is. When I moved to Texas State, I had fewer resources. And my role is different. I don't get to spend as much time in the field. And it took a long time for me to be okay with that. Sometimes I'm still not okay with it. But during COVID, I got a horse. I started, and that was a huge thing for me. And so I definitely have, I would say, if it was my mother, she would say, oh, you have a life now. But before, I also thought I had a life. I did. I don't regret as the amount of work I did, but I do like this. What I've seen, what I think has been going on, is this more recognition of not having to work 24/7. We don't have to do that. You can actually have a life outside of academia.
You don't even have to wait for retirement. It's just apparently. Okay, we have come to the end of our time period now, and thank you very much. Great time.